Listeners, we're back with darling dearest Shellye, who is going to be with us on the podcast today. How are you, love?
I am doing well, and I am so excited to be here with you and get a moment to chat with you. This is great.
I know you've been working on something that I know is such a personal passion for you, and it is a relatively new initiative here in the community, and so this is our opportunity to talk about it. So Shellye, tell us everything. Tell us everything about Mild Matters and what you're doing and what the project and the initiative is.
I am so excited, and I will try to tell you everything without talking your ear off. It is definitely a passion project of mine, without a doubt. And it actually started over 2 years ago when I was hired at HFA. And we were looking at all the different ways we can really support and serve the community. And we were doing so much work for women, and we were making great strides. And of course, there's still a long way to go, as we know, but we were getting somewhere, right? And I started listening when I was at events, and I realized that there were things that weren't lining up. So, for example, when you look at milds with hemophilia A and B who are being seen at HTCs, when you dive into that community counts data, what I found was 19% of the milds seen at HTCs were women, but 80 to 90% of the milds with hemophilia A and B showing up at all of our events were women. So there was this huge disconnect. And I realized that the mild men were gone. They were off the radar. We'd get, on occasion, a mild man or two in our midst, but as a whole, they were gone. And I started talking to HTCs, and I was like, what's going on? They're like, yeah, we can't get them into the comprehensive clinic visits either. We're missing them. And I realized as I backed up that there was this gaping hole. And if we would widen that net to include milds, we would capture most of the women. Not all. We do have some women who are moderate and severe. We have some women who have severe types of von Willebrand disease and rare factor deficiencies. But for the most part, if we widen the net, we would capture most of the women and also have an opportunity to bring in these mild men who were off the radar with mild hemophilia, with mild rare factor deficiencies, with VWD. So it was really an opportunity to include more people and be more inclusive. So that's how it started. And then it just kept growing. And one of the things that really came up right away was equity issues just across the board. So in 2022, we had our first gathering where we brought together representatives from three groups. We brought together mild men, mild women, and parents of mild children to start talking about the struggles. We felt like we had an okay handle on the struggles that the women were facing, not that they were getting as far as we want them to get in terms of access to diagnosis and treatment, but we felt like we could define that problem. And for the most part, we could define the men's problems too. They were also struggling to access treatment. They were really frustrated that they couldn't self-infuse. And they just really felt like they weren't being heard or taken seriously. What we hadn't anticipated were the responses we received from parents. And parents really started bringing up equity issues. They would say, my child with mild hemophilia was sent to camp, and they met this severe who's on prophy and playing contact sports, playing basketball, playing soccer. And my child is told that they need to not play these sports because they're not as protected, right? So the severe would be brought up to, say, 100% factor right before a game and was able to play, while a mild with maybe 20, 30% factor was told no sports for you. So that was a really big divide we saw, and a point of contention among parents, right? What about my kid? They should be able to play too. So we found that really fascinating and eye-opening, and it made a lot of sense. And then adults were saying, well, wait, we want to be active too. How can we as milds be active? And I when you look at kind of the history and the evolution of individuals with mild bleeding disorders, for years, right? Women went from being symptomatic carriers to actually being recognized as having disease. That struggle is still a little hard because if a woman's factor levels with hemophilia in particular are above 40, they are still labeled symptomatic carrier, and those below 40 are labeled mild hemophilia. So we haven't hit it yet, and we know that factor levels don't necessarily even correlate with bleeding tendencies, but we're getting closer. And I think part of the reason that we've seen a big jump in getting closer is the fact that so many severes have gone on prophylaxis that have rendered them mild. And as the severes have been rendered mild, and lo and behold, they're still getting bleeds, it's given credibility to all the milds who have said for years, really, we're bleeding, like pay attention to us. And I think it took the severes being treated and still ending up with bleeds on occasion to give that credibility to all the milds who are saying, no, really, our factor levels aren't high enough to prevent bleeds. We are struggling. So that's kind of a quick history.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to talk more about the events and what we've done, but I think that's a quick get you to this point. Sorry if I talked.
No, that's really cool. Like, as you have identified some of these, gaps in education and awareness and treatment, and kind of the standards of care, what did your team at HFA set out to do about it? And this could kind of go into some of the events that you guys have had, but tell us a little bit about the journey towards action, about what you guys wanted to do.
Absolutely. Empowerment, education and empowerment are the things that we want to do.
And so much acknowledgement too, like acknowledging, like even just having a thing is so important. So anyway, sorry to interrupt.
No, I love that. I actually love that you did, because it is that validity means so much. Having someone say to you, you're not crazy, this isn't in your head. I think that can be as healing sometimes as even moving towards accessing treatment, just knowing that you're not alone and that these issues are real. And what we did is, after we had that first event where we really listened, we wanted to flip it to an event where we could offer practical suggestions, advice, education. And that's what we did with our 2023 patient event. And we really looked at providing tools to patients so that they could walk in to their provider and say, hey, here's my patient's story. I think that we're not communicating well. And I truly believe that part of the reason milds aren't getting their needs met is because there's this disconnect. So what I think I'm describing as my patient bleeding experience may not be aligning with what the provider is hearing. So we're missing it. So we talked about things like creating bleeding logs, and we gave bleeding logs. By the way, there's a little push for that. You can find them on our website. We have some phenomenal former staff members who spent hours and hours developing these logs and creating a phenomenal resource to our community. So that can be found on our website, and individuals can track menstrual bleeding. They can track other bleeds, and it gives an opportunity to start creating some sort of paper trail for physicians. And we really encourage that these then be uploaded into patient provider communication systems like a MyChart, if they have that. The other thing we really encouraged is to photograph anything you possibly can. And I tell a story at these events of an elbow bleed that I had. And I called this really sympathetic nurse, and she was like, hey, what's going on? I was like, I bumped my elbow and there's a bleed. And she starts asking me these questions that were the right questions to ask. She's like, how big is it? Well, I have a small elbow. So it's like maybe like an inch by an inch. And then she asks, how big is the swelling? I'm like, I don't know, like a half an inch. And then she asked, well, is it black and blue? And I was like, no. And she asked me, well, can you bend it? I'm like, yes, but it's stiff and it hurts. And I know that what she was picturing in her head was not the bleed picture I ended up showing, which was very, very clearly a hematoma under my skin that very clearly needed factor treatment. And the minute you see the picture, there's no doubt, there's a bleed. But the the speaking back and forth, something got lost in the communication. And I think it was on both parts because she was asking the right questions and I felt like I was answering them, but it wasn't translating in that communication to she has a bleed that needs to be treated. And I think that if we can strengthen that communication and that understanding of the patient's story, we can get to like diagnosis and treatment faster. And that's really my goal personally, and I HFA's as well, when it comes to education. How can we empower patients to gather this data so that they won't be turned away accidentally? Because I really think a lot of these HTCs don't even mean to. The other thing that we talked a lot about is not presenting it as a problem patient. Like if we come in angry, and a lot of us have a right to be angry, but if we come in angry, we don't necessarily get that far, and doctors can get defensive. I know when I was a former school principal, I got defensive when I was a school principal and people came at me in anger. So we really encourage them to try to move themselves to being the patient with the medical problem versus the problem patient, and really working at defining that medical problem in a way that the MDs or HCPs can hear us without immediately going into a defensive, if that makes sense. Does that
Oh,
make
that makes
sense?
total sense. Shellye, that's great. No, it totally does. You mentioned a little bit, HFA has gone through restructuring, and I think there's some questions still that the community might have. And so, tell me a little bit about this program's longevity and health. Do you feel good and sturdy within it, within HFA's backing?
I feel like HFA is really taking an opportunity right now to step back, as many organizations do in times of growth, and say, let's look at what has the most impact for the greatest amount of people in our community. I know one of the things that our CEO has said multiple times is that one of his concerns is that there are, I think, over 1 million people with VWD, for example, who aren't even on the radar. And I have to say, when I personally think of people with mild bleeding disorders, I am definitely worried about all the women and men in our midst who we know of who aren't getting the treatment they need. And I am absolutely terrified of all the men and women in our midst who don't even know that they have a bleeding disorder and even should be on a radar. And they are in more danger showing up at an ER than those of us who are still screaming for treatment, but we at least know to scream, right? We know to stand up for ourselves. And there are arguably potentially over 1 million people who don't. And I know that that has been expressed as a concern. And the question is, as we reorganize and we restructure, how do we reach the individual people who aren't on our radar? How do we connect maybe with different social service organizations? How do we find a way to get this message out to the greater community? And I know that there are lots of ideas, not just at HFA, but also when we met just a week and a half ago with physicians from HTCs across the United States and talked about mild issues, they also said, how do we reach OBGYNs? How do we reach primary care physicians and PAs and nurse practitioners and dentists who are often that first line of communication and get individuals on the radar? So I think right now we have more questions than answers, but I do feel like we're asking the right questions. We're definitely recognizing that there is an issue, and part of restructuring allows an organization to step back and say, how can we meet needs in new ways? And sometimes, we need to restructure to do that, even though it can be painful.
Well said, pal. Well said. Thank you so much for being with us today and sharing more about this. This has just been wonderful. I guess to kind of wrap us up, tell me a little bit, and our listeners, about what is on the horizon for Mild Matters this year. What's going to happen at Symposium, and what's coming down the pipe in 2024?
So first, I just have to say, if you let me cut me off. First, what I really want to say is that I have to give kudos. We had 25 HTC hematologists, 25 HTC hematologists from 17 states and Puerto Rico who gave their time to gather with us in Tulsa, Oklahoma from February 7th to the 9th to really start to address some of the issues that patients are facing. So we took all of that patient input and we said to the providers, here's what we're hearing. What can we do? And they had didactic sessions and they broke out into peer groups and they started discussing really critical issues like timing of testing of infant boys and infant girls, because we found that there was a lag, that infant girls tended to be like tested, particularly when at risk for hemophilia A or B, they tended to be tested later on than infant boys, which of course makes no sense because an infant girl at risk for bleeding, we want to know their factor levels. We want that medic alert bracelet on their wrist if they end up in a car accident at age 1 or 2 to say that they can be tested, sometimes before menstruation doesn't make sense when it comes to protecting them in an emergency. So we talked about those sorts of issues. We talked about the use of prophylaxis when appropriate for sports or other issues when the bleeding indicates it. So it's not, they weren't saying that every mild is going to be put on prophylaxis, and surely every mild doesn't need it. There's a treatment burden. However, there are individuals who are struggling with bleeding and they might need access to, and prophylaxis, by the way, doesn't just mean factor. It means any product that helps with bleeding, right? So tranexamic acid, DDAVP, these other things in our toolkit, even hormonal therapy in an essence could be a prophylactic treatment. It's something you take to prevent the bleeding, right? And for some, that may mean access to factor products all the time. For some, it may mean while they're menstruating or before sports or just during a sports season, but looking at how we can be open to that when appropriate and when the bleeding seems to indicate it. We also had, I'm going to give a shout out to Dr. Mira Chitler. She is amazing. She's a pediatrician in Michigan who has been a strong supporter, and she gave a presentation to the other providers that was fantastic. And she was asking the question, are we accepting the same things for milds as we are for severes? So as we've rendered severes mild, we ask the question, how many bleeds are too many bleeds? And when you look at some of the research, you see that we try to get to 0 bleeds for severes, but we may be accepting 1 or 2 bleeds a year or more in mild. So there's this question of equity in what we're willing to accept. And shouldn't that be the same? If we really want severes to not experience bleeds because we believe it's healthier for them and their joints long term, should it be the same for milds? And I think it's a good question that we need to ask ourselves. Are we really getting everyone to the same point? Another question that came up as we gathered the physicians is if with the new novel therapies that increases that trough level. So say an individual with hemophilia A might end their week at 15 or 20% factor before they have their next infusion because some of the new therapies, or they may be held at a more consistent state because of some of the therapies. What are we doing for milds who may have those lower levels, right? They may be at the lower end of mild from 6 to 15%. It could be that we now have milds who are actually being left at trough levels lower than our severes. So all great questions. And I think these are all things that we're going to continue to debate as we move forward. And the physicians are interested. They want to engage. They want to know how to help out. And they want to gather that information. They want to understand more about that bleeding story, see the photos of the bleeds, understand what's going on. So I envision as we move forward that we're going to somehow miraculously figure out how to reach the many individuals not on the radar at all, pull them in, get them the education they need so that they're not the woman who shows up at the ER in a rural town who doesn't understand they have a bleeding disorder and whose ER docs aren't equipped to even begin to understand that there may be more there. How do we reach those men and women? I don't think we have the answers yet, but I know we're asking the questions. And then how do we work with the physicians to make sure that then these individuals have that landing space that they need to get to the qualified providers at HTCs and really get the help that they need. And I will also say, I know sometimes we get so frustrated with providers as a community. And I think that we have to step back and acknowledge our providers are so overworked. They are understaffed. We know that many of the hematology oncology fellowships went unfilled this year. And we know that there are HTCs who have been advertising for adult hematologists, for example, for a long time, even over a year or more, and they're not getting the providers. So on one hand, we're talking about over 1 million people with VWD that we need to funnel to the HTCs. Then there's also this question of, are we going to drown the providers because we're not necessarily finding them individuals who go into hematology? Oncology is pretty enticing when it often comes with higher salaries and I feel like we need to just give a huge screaming thank you to the providers who are in our community because they're choosing to go into classical hematology and work with all of us. And they're often doing it in centers that aren't necessarily staffed to the levels that they want them to be. And they're taking on a lot of stress and they're working an incredible amount of hours to help us, right? It's amazing.
Shellye, fantastic points and just such a important, timely initiative. This is so exciting. Tell listeners where folks can hear more about Mild Matters through HFA, maybe website or some other platforms.
Definitely go to HFA's website, and I think that that's probably the absolute best place to find resources, and that's hemophiliafed.org. And number one, that's where I would say head over to there and reach out, come to Symposium. Every year at Symposium, we do a Mild Matters wrap session where we chat. And then we also do a Mild Matters, we just have different didactic sessions that are available as well.
Shellye, thank you so much for joining us today and telling us a little bit more. We'll make sure to have you back to get updates as we go along. This is wonderful. Thank you, pal.
Oh, thank you so much.